Hello, everybody, and welcome to our second lecture for the semester. Before we get into talking about evolutionary theory and all the kind of inner workings and ins and outs of it, it's kind of important for us to talk a little bit about the guy who came up with modern evolutionary theory and biology, a gentleman named Charles Darwin, right? And before we talk about Charles Darwin, we need to kind of set the stage for the kind of cultural and scientific context in which Darwin was living at the time he did his research. So Darwin kind of synthesized important realizations from 5 separate scientific disciplines of his time. We'll talk a little bit about each of these and what he kind of gleaned from them. We have geology, paleontology, taxonomy, which is how do we categorize creatures, demography, as well as biology, including, or more particularly, embryology. So evolution itself, the definition that we use today is it's the changes in the forms of organic life that have occurred throughout time since life first arose on Earth. And Darwin wasn't the first to talk about evolutionary change or even species changing over the course of time, right? Other scientists before him discussed evolution, and some thought that species were capable of change over time, right? And one of those people was actually Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus. So really, Darwin was actually just kind of picking up intellectually where his grandfather had left off in terms of talking about how a species can change over time. So what happened before Darwin's kind of revolutionary work? Most naturalists at the time were heavily influenced by the Bible. In essence, most scientific and naturalist studies at the time were seeking to kind of prove the historical accuracy of the Bible. This was based on a study by Bishop Ussher, and the believed age of the Earth was 4,004 years old, right? And this kind of really smacked in the face of what Darwin's thoughts were on evolution, because in order for Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection to work, he needed this concept of immense time, right? During this period, kind of this 18th and early 19th century, most naturalists simply went around the world and collected curiosities from across the globe without much real academic study, right? And they would collect all sorts of things. They would collect natural objects like minerals and rocks. They would collect ethnographic objects like hunting tools from faraway tribes or canoes, things like that. And one of the earliest naturalists that we have that really started this trend was a guy named Ole Worm, who lived from 1588 to 1654. And the worm collection actually still exists today. In the next slide, you're going to see a picture of all the things that Ole Worm actually collected during his time. And we kind of call this period the age of antiquarianism, right, where we're running around collecting curiosities without much thought of really academic study. An example of this that I'll give you is crystal quartz, right? We all know today that crystal quartz is formed geologically and comes out of the earth. Well, during the time or the age of antiquarianism, a lot of naturalists called it thunderstone because they believed that it was actually trapped lightning that was created when lightning struck Earth. So this is showing you the Ole Worm Museum that's still in operation today. It's one of the world's oldest museums. And you can see all the various random things, some natural items as well as some man-made items were collected. This is showing you a different perspective of the same museum. So it's just kind of a single one-room museum. So during this time, naturalists were really concerned with this notion of monogenesis or polygenesis, right? Was there a single creation event or a multiple creation event? And up until basically the 19th century, most were kind of supporting this notion of monogenesis, and this was based off of the biblical concept of the great chain of being, which is the idea that you can rank species from simple to complex, right? Being the most simple being our kind of plants and invertebrates to our most complex being humans, right? And the kind of religious organizations at the time kind of took this concept and also assigned kind of a closeness to God type scale with it too. So of course, humans being on the top, we're closer to kind of the celestial beings, the angels, and God, and the rest of the beings on the bottom kind of being farther away from God. So it kind of actually led to a bit of a justification of we can do whatever we want with the environment, or we can do whatever we want with the creatures who live here because they are low lower in the order than we are, right? So early naturalists believed in this notion of a single creation event in which all species that exist on Earth today were created at the same time by God. But fossils were occasionally found during this period, and they were thought to be imperfect creations that were cast down to earth from heaven by God. He was angry or frustrated at some small flaw, turned them into stone, and threw them down to the earth, right? This is honestly what naturalists believed in terms of where fossils originated. So looking at some other scientific aspects of the time during the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe, we have the examination of nature and all of its aspects, including, our own human bodies, right? We have a doctor named Vesalius, who is a Renaissance anatomist who dissected cadavers or human cadavers illegally, because up until the 18th century in many countries, it was illegal to dissect human beings, right? You actually had to, most early anatomists, most early doctors worked on pig carcasses because their anatomy was somewhat similar to humans because of that legal prohibition. We also have a gentleman named Harvey who determined how blood flows within the human body, as well as we see a revival of botany, or at least a scientific interest in botany or the study of medicinal plants during this period. So giving you some more details about Andreas Vesalius, he lived from 1514 to 1564. He was a Flemish anatomist who trained and taught at the University of Padua. He was jailed several times for operating on cadavers and published the world's first official book on human anatomy. By the end of his life, Vesalius was advocating for physicians to stop bloodletting as a cure for illness, which was actually one of the primary medical treatments at the time for any type of kind of viral or bacterial illness. You were bled, and that bleeding was thought to drain the toxins from your body and allow you to recover more quickly, right? And Vesalius recognized the importance of blood and how much of it was really needed for the human body to operate normally. So he really advocated against this notion of bloodletting. And what is really important, and something that we haven't really come fully to grips with, is that during this kind of time period, we started to have the recognition that humans do have a degree of impact on the environment around them, and more importantly, they do have a fair degree of impact on the other animal species around them. But because of this whole notion of the great chain of being, many naturalists, many scientists, many politicians, as well as people in industry really didn't kind of conceive that we could have a damaging effect on the environment and animal species around, or really didn't care because for the most part they had this kind of cultural belief that, well, since we're human and we're smarter and we're larger, that we have natural credence to go over and do whatever we want with what's going on Earth, right, whether they're plants or animals. But we can see on this recent timeline, it's actually not recent, came out in 2008, but it is still kind of very salient and relevant today, looks at kind of the number of extinctions of animal and plant species that have occurred over time, and looks at the increase in human population over time, right? So as human population increases, our level of extinctions that occur, or species that go extinct on the planet, dramatically increases too. So you can't really ignore that kind of association that we see. So Darwin also worked on a revised age of the Earth, and this was based off of work that was done by James Hutton and Charles Lyell, right? In order for the immense diversity of life forms that we see on Earth today to have arisen by Darwin's concept of natural selection, Darwin needed the concept of deep time, right? He really needed millions of years in order for these slow, minute evolutionary changes to occur, and that was provided to him by James Hutton and Charles Lyell, particularly by James Hutton, who really determined that the Earth was much older than the Bible actually states, based on some examination of some sedimentary rocks off of the coast of Scotland. So Hutton himself lived from 1726 to 1797. He published his ideas in the book entitled Theory of the Earth. He debated the established age of the Earth at the time, which most scholars claim the Earth began on October 23rd, 4004 BC. And this is really interesting. This was based off of that study I mentioned before from Bishop Ussher. And what Bishop Ussher did in order to get to this number for the age of the Earth is he went through the Bible and counted the generations that the Bible Bible wrote about. And kind of counting backward in time, that's where he ended up at 4004 BC. And Hutton actually made the assertion that Earth is ancient due to different rock types at this place called Seacar Point in Scotland. And he noted how metamorphic rock cut through the red sandstone, and noted that that sandstone had to have been there before that metamorphic rock was able to cut through it, right? When knowing that, that sandstone, based on observations, took long periods of time to formulate. So this is showing you that kind of rock at Seacar's Point. You can kind of see how you have some layers that are laid horizontally and then some layers that are laid vertically as well, right? In order for that to kind of happen, you need long processes and long, slow periods of time where the Earth is kind of churning and moving and upending these different layers of rock. So how do we know that the Earth is old? This is based off of a concept that was proposed by Charles Lyell. It's the idea that the forces that change the Earth's crust now are the same forces that have helped shape it throughout time. This is called uniformitarianism, all right? And these processes, based on observations by Charles Lyell, are very slow and gradual, right? So he's kind of extrapolating that, well, if it takes a long time today to see these changes in geology to happen, then it must have taken a long time in the past. And, kind of extending that out, it realizes that the Earth is much, 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 much older than the Bible states. And he looked at also erosion patterns. How do different, rocks break down, right? We looked at decomposition. He looked at wind erosion as well as water erosion, as well as the erosion that occurs via frost. He also looked at dramatic events like volcanic activity, as well as plate tectonics and earthquakes. And three kind of prevailing geologic notions came out of this time. This notion of catastrophism, that volcanoes, floods, and earthquakes are examples of catastrophic events that were once believed responsible for mass extinction events and the formation of all landforms, which, there is some truth to that. We do know that a lot of volcanic activity is what really spurred a lot of early land formation on Earth, but that was long before, life arose on Earth. We also have this notion of gradualism, that canyons carved by rivers show gradual change, right? Gradualism is the idea that changes on Earth occurred by small steps over very long periods of time, right? And then, of course, uniformitarianism, in which rock strata demonstrate that geological processes, which are still occurring today, add up over long periods of time to cause great change. And then along with that, Lyell also proposed this notion of superposition, right? And it's a real easy concept to remember. It's basically saying that when you dig a hole in the earth, you're going to have different layers of rock and different layers of dirt. And the layers of rock at the bottom of your hole are going to be older than the layers of rock at the top of your hole, right? So that basically means that the earth is laid down in very uniform layers. Moving on, we also have Darwin borrowing concepts from taxonomy from the Swedish botanist named Carolus Linnaeus, or Carl Linnaeus as we call him, who lived from 1707 to 1778. And it's kind of interesting because Linnaeus actually set out with his taxonomic study, or his study to kind of classify living things, based on an agreement with this notion of the great chain of being concept. And he was responsible for developing our modern taxonomic system that we use, right? We all know it: class, genus, or class, order, genus, species, right? And genus and species is what provides that unique scientific Latin name that we call binomial nomenclature, right? And Linnaeus believed it was the naturalist's duty to study the fixed nature of the universe, and he derived the first classic racial classification system that was used for humans as well. But he didn't call them races at that point; he called them subspecies of the human species. So Carolus Linnaeus created the taxonomic system that we use today, but he created it because he believed that all species were static and never change, right? So we still kind of use his taxonomic system, but have abandoned this notion that species are incapable of change. So this is just showing you an example of the Linnaean taxonomic system for macacas. We have the genus Macaca, the species name Mulatta, and then the common name Rhesus, right? So if we have Macaca mulatta, we're looking at the Rhesus macaques. If we have Macaca nemasrina, we're looking at the pig-tailed macaques. If we have the Macaca fuchsiata, we're looking at the Japanese snow monkeys. So Linnaeus developed our first scientific classification system for plants and animals, but also tried to classify humans as well into subspecies. He had Americanus, which were, of course, quote-unquote Native American people or people of red skin. He had Europaeus, which were the white individuals. He had Asiaticus, which were people of the sallow skin color. The Afars, which were people of black colors. He had a couple odd categories, too, for leaving a little wiggle room in there in case we found something that we haven't discovered yet, like the Ferris man who lives in the caves and lives on all four. We have troglodytes, who are ignorant people who live in caves as well. We also have monstrous, which are giants, and mutants, right? So Linnaeus wanted to leave a lot of wiggle room for his taxonomic system there. He also worked on classifying plants as well. And we have another contemporary of Linnaeus called Comte de Buffon, who tried to create his own classification system, but is actually more commonly remembered today for popularizing the term race in classifying humans over the Linnaean term subspecies. He's one of the first to believe in a geographic and climatic origin for race. For example, in his writings, he said that Africans had dark skin because the sun had burnt them, noting that in essence there was more sunlight in Africa than there was in Europe. He also believed in the fixity of species, that species were incapable of change over time. That's why his notion of race worked so well for him, right? Because the races were, in essence to him, separate species. They were not subspecies. They were, in fact, separate and distinct. We also have Georges Cuvier a little bit later on, from 1769 to 1832. He's considered the father of modern paleontology, and he collected large quantities of fossils. He was actually one of the first to believe that fossils can be scientifically examined. He believed in the notion of catastrophism, that, and we talked about that a few slides ago, that these great catastrophic events were really what was responsible for these large-scale changes in the Earth as well as species over time. He focused on biostratigraphy in the strata of the Parisian Basin, initially looking at fish, and he did not believe in natural or evolution via natural selection. He supported this notion of cyclical evolution, right, or cyclical extinction. So in essence, what happens is every so often there's a major catastrophic event. Most of the creatures become extinct. Out of that, all the new creatures are essentially created. So he proposed catastrophism, right? And to kind of go over it briefly real quick here again, it's the notion that the changes in the Earth's crust during geologic history have resulted chiefly from sudden, violent, and unusual events, as well as causing these mass extinction events, right? So things like volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, meteor strikes, all of these things would be considered catastrophic events. So in part of his career, he also looked a lot at categorizing race and came up with his own racial classification system for humans based off of his research on his dissections of Sarah Bartman in 1817, who was a native woman from Cape Town, South Africa. And Cuvier claimed, based on some rather spurious statistical data, as well as really not knowing what an orangutan looks like, claimed that she had anatomy that was more similar to that of an orangutan than human, thus further supporting his notion that, humans, there are separate species of humans that correspond to race. Unfortunately, Sarah spent most of her life on display in a traveling zoo in Europe before finally retiring and dying in Cape Town, South Africa. But why did Cuvier have these assumptions? Well, at the time, scientists wanted to find a different way in which Africans evolved into humans, right? Because that would justify the existing social order, right? With Africans being placed in a lower position in society than people of lighter skin tones, right? So this was during a time when most scholars, refuted a common ape ancestor for humans, right? Remember, this is before Darwin. This is before we had a concept of natural selection and before we had a concept of evolution. So just showing you Cuvier's racial categorical system. He had Caucasians, Mongolians, and Ethiopians to correspond to Europeans, Asians, and Africans. He did not even consider Native Americans to be quote-unquote human. And what he did is he took minor differences in skeletal anatomy and used them to create a racial system which mirrored the social inequality and social injustice system that existed at the time. Moving on, Darwin also borrowed elements from demography, and that came from Thomas Malthus, who wrote a lot about populations and the problems of population increases. Right? He believed that populations grow faster than the food supply of any given population, which will inevitably lead for a struggle for existence, and not all will survive this struggle. And he said that the effects of crowding and food shortage are not random on whom they kill, right? That the weaker or the essentially the those weaker in health are at greater risk of dying. And, you know, Malthus is really kind of cited as kind of being one of the early progenitors or early fathers of this notion of social Darwinism, right? That those who are best apt to survive tend to do better in society, and those who are weaker and have a weaker constitution tend to die out, right? And we know today that this is absolutely ridiculous, right? There are tons of social and cultural factors that deny a person access to wealth, healthcare, and education, right? So this really isn't, you know, social Darwinism really doesn't hold much credence in terms of actual science. We also have, before Darwin, a gentleman named Jean-Baptiste de Monet Chevalier de Lamarck, who, you know, the human who has the longest name in existence. And he came up with the notion of the inheritance of acquired traits. And this is the idea that if someone worked with their arms, for example, a blacksmith pounding metal for decades, making swords and armor and all sorts of what have you, they would develop a very large muscular arm, right? Lamarck believed that when that blacksmith would go to have a child, they would pass that large arm on to their son, and their son would be born with having more muscle mass on their arm. This is what he believed was the inheritance of acquired traits. So in Lamarck's view, it was essentially stretching of the neck. If we look at giraffes, for an example, that a giraffe stretches its neck to reach higher and higher leaves over time, which means that the offspring will be born with a longer neck. This is not exactly how genetics works. We know that today, right? And based off of modern genetics, we could say that this is really how it works. If by chance there was a giraffe born with a longer neck, it would have an advantage over the other giraffes, right, in terms of getting more food. It might be more likely to live longer and breed more. The genetics for the longer neck giraffe get passed on to the babies. Thus, in the next generation, you have more longer neck giraffes that are born, right? Because that giraffe, the original one that was born with a long neck, was more successful at breeding. And as we're going to come to find out throughout the course of the semester, the name of the game in evolution is breeding and passing genes from one generation to the next. And that leads us to good old Grandpappy Darwin. Graduated from Cambridge College. He actually was originally set to go into the kind of seminary school and become a priest or a minister in the Church of England. His first scientific expedition was on the HMS Beagle, which is the one he's most famous for. And what he was really interested in was studying the effects that habitat environment had on the animals that lived within that environment. This is showing you Darwin's kind of route that he took. So essentially he gathered data from many different environments throughout the world and came up with the concept of natural selection, right? And he provided a mechanism and synthesized important findings from all of those major scientific disciplines that we talked about previously in this lecture. He also supported his ideas with many, many examples from the natural world. Careful work he did over more than 20 years, starting during his travels on the HMS Beagle around the world as a young man. So it's not like he came back from his voyage around the world as a science officer on the Beagle and immediately came up with the idea and wrote it. He had the idea, but he was kind of careful about how he went about publishing and writing about it. It took him over 20 years to essentially culminate his research and actually begin to publish it. So natural selection, as defined by Darwin, is the biological traits or inherited characteristics that enhance an organism's survival in an environment would likely increase in frequency throughout time. So applying kind of our modern scientific knowledge on it, we can say that genes that give an organism an advantage in a certain environment will be favored and will increase in frequency throughout time. That is what is natural selection. So naturalists, starting with Darwin, began to really be concerned with variation, and not just variation between species. They wanted to see the variation we see in a single species. More importantly, sexual dimorphism, which is the differences between males and females of a given species. Right? Darwin is kind of known for his origin of species and talking about natural selection, but there are other elements of Darwin's work that have provided some pretty fundamental concepts in modern evolutionary biology. He talked a lot about sexual selection, or how mates choose each other within a given species. He also talked a lot about what we call today environmental niches, or specialty species that exist only in very certain environmental conditions. So the next couple of slides will just show you real briefly some of these images that came out of Darwin's original work from some of the data he gathered and some of the creatures he saw throughout his travels on the HMS Beagle. So it's showing you just a giant bat that he came across, showing you some of the water mammalia that he came across, as well as some of the jungle cats. And now we land at Darwin's kind of most famous research, which is his work on the Galapagos Islands, which has the greatest faunal diversity of land birds that we see in the world, and even has a unique group of finches that occurs nowhere else on the planet. And of course, finches, if you're not familiar, are kind of small birds, much like these sparrows and robins that we see outside here in Ohio. So just showing you there were all sorts of different finches. Some were seed-eating finches. Some were finches that ate fruit. Some were finches that drank nectar out of flowers. Some were finches that ate grasses. Some were finches that even kind of fished for small shrimp and small shellfish. So what he was really looking at was this notion of an environmental niche, right? There was only one ground species of ground finch in the nearby mainland, but there were over a dozen different species in the Galapagos Island, each with its own pattern of distribution. Many of the species on the Galapagos are confined to just one island or one part of one island, right? And all show variation in beaks and diet, right? There are ground as well as tree-dwelling, insect as well as seed eaters. And what Darwin hypothesized was that sometime in the ancient past, one of that, a small population of those ground finches that we find in the nearby mainland got trapped on the Galapagos Islands and began to diversify in order to, fill all of these different food sources that were available on the island. This is showing you from Darwin's original work. So what Darwin was really looking at was this notion of a niche, right? Some finch species were filling roles that were normally occupied by totally unrelated bird species on other continents, right? You have a hummingbird niche, which was occupied by a small finch with a long beak and who had rapid wing beats, much like a hummingbird that we see on the mainland. You had a woodpecker niche, which was occupied by a finch that had a chisel-like beak that was used for drilling holes in trees, and even has a stiff woodpecker-like tail that is used as a kind of prop that kind of keeps their puts force behind their kind of pecking. There was also even a blood drinking niche, which is usually occupied by insects and other kind of bats and birds on the mainland, but they had a vampire finch who would actually latch on to larger birds and drink their blood. So just showing you the woodpecker niche that we see with the small stiff tail and the kind of hard beak used for drilling holes in the side of trees. This is showing the vampire finch, which is feeding on a larger bird. And what Darwin was really looking at with this process of diversification amongst these finches was this notion of descent with modification, right? This is a branching evolutionary process in which related species, such as the 13 species of finches that we find on the Galapagos Islands, share a common ancestor. Using the finches, for example, the common ancestor was that ground finch from the mainland, right? So what he was saying was that species were mutable or subject to change, and this was very upsetting to him because it was like confessing to murder, right? Because remember, at the time, the prevailing scientific thought was that this universe was fixed and species were incapable of change. So Darwin didn't publish any of his evolutionary ideas until 22 years after the Beagle returned, and he kind of returned to kind of his life as a scholarly, wealthy gentleman in the English countryside. So the question is why did he sit on the most revolutionary notion in the history of biology? Well, it's because it included something more heretical than evolution itself, the notion of philosophical materialism, that there is no striving towards organic perfection, just random variation and natural selection acting upon that variation within species, right? That we are not progressively moving towards perfecting ourselves overall as a species, right? It's just these natural processes that happen and variation acting upon it. We also have a letter that occurred or came to Darwin from a gentleman named Alfred Wallace in 1858 that really pushed him into this notion of publishing his ideas. To talk a little bit about Alfred Wallace, he's kind of a lesser known figure in evolutionary theory, even though he kind of came up with the same idea as Darwin at the same time. He went to South America on a collecting expedition for 4 years, and he later went to the Malayan archipelago in Indonesia, and he arrived independently at the same idea as Darwin, that species are subject to change. And how he arrived at this was kind of interesting. Wallace was stricken with malarial fever, which is a parasitic disease that's very deadly to people who are not accustomed to it, and near death. So he was kind of thinking about death, and he started thinking that death would fall unequally on members of variable species, right? Some species, some individuals would live long lives, some would be killed by predators, some would be killed by disease, right? And some would die near birth, right? So there was this variation in terms of how death affected a given species, so which would inevitably lead to various traits being passed on, which would inevitably lead to change over time, right? Going back to Darwin, he was very depressed and indecisive. He didn't want Wallace to get credit for something he and even his grandfather had thought of, but he wanted Wallace to get credit for thinking of the same thing independently. So in kind of one of the great kumbaya moments of science, Darwin contacted Wallace, they communicated with each other, and eventually agreed to publish very close in proximity with one another in terms of date so that they would both equally get credit. The difference is that Wallace published a 20-page journal article and Darwin published an over 200-page book, right? So Darwin is kind of the guy who gets the credit today, and Wallace is kind of forgotten in the annals of history. So this all wasn't counting the work that was done by Gregor Mendel, right? Darwin did not know how traits were passed from parents to offspring. He was completely unaware of the research being done by Gregor Mendel, a monk who was working with pea plants in the Czech Republic, right? Mendel's experiments eventually showed that traits were determined by genes, or these tiny discrete physical units of information that are passed from one generation to the next in both plants and animals. This is just showing you the different traits that Mendel discovered that did not blend. So what Mendel really kind of teased out was also this notion of polygenic versus monogenic traits, right? Mendel really determined all the monogenic traits, ones that did not blend with each other because they were controlled by single gene pairs. He had no idea about polygenic traits like hair color in humans or skin color in humans are two good examples of polygenic traits. So we now know today that alternate forms of a gene are now called alleles, and alleles are either dominant or recessive, right? And it's really the combination of genes from each parent that determines the trait expressed in the offspring, right? This was later confirmed by breeding experiments by a gentleman named Morgan in 1908 with fruit flies that essentially repeated Mendel's work, right? And discovered that genes and chromosomes are transmitted during reproductive cell division. So this is showing you just kind of some research or kind of photos that weren't taken during Morgan's experiment, but this is from a subsequent experiment many, many years later. And we determined by manipulating certain genes, we can have fruit flies that were born with smooth wings and fruit flies that were born with curved wings, right? So we were able to confirm both Morgan's experiments, Mendel's experiments, and essentially Darwin's notion on natural selection. So what is a gene? Well, a gene is the basic unit of inheritance. Genes are always inherited as pairs. You get one gene from your mom and one gene from your dad. And a gene codes for the production of a specific protein, right? And proteins are the name of the game in evolution, right? We're going to learn with our talk on genetics in the next lecture that proteins are very important for all of the various functions within our bodies. Naturally, genes have different variations. If they didn't, we'd all be the same, and we call those variations alleles. And our genes are the molecular basis for DNA, right? And DNA is the molecular basis for evolution, right? And the structure of DNA was published in 1953 by Watson and Crick, but they were actually not the individuals who discovered it. It was actually discovered by a lab assistant of theirs named Rosalind Franklin, and because she was a woman, she really didn't get credit until much, much later in time. This is showing you the photograph that was originally taken by Rosalind Franklin, which suggests the double helix structure of DNA. And kind of coming close to wrapping up the lecture here, what has Darwin's work really culminated in? Well, this notion of evolutionary forces, right? And we have four distinct forces in evolution today, right? We have natural selection, which we've already talked about, which acts on already existing genes, favoring some and disfavoring others. Then we have mutation, which is the only creative force in evolution, right? It's the formation of new genetic material and happens as an error during cell duplication. Then we have gene flow, which is a spread of genetic material from one population to another. And finally, wrapping up here with gene drift or genetic drift, which is the random changes in the frequency of alleles, which is an especially strong force in small populations of creatures. So looking at another concept that Darwin came up with, the notion of sexual selection, right, which is almost as important as natural selection, right? And coming from Darwin's work itself, the sexual struggle is of two kinds. In the one, it is between individuals of the same sex, generally the males, in order to drive away or kill their rivals, the females remaining passive. Whilst in the other, the struggle is likewise between individuals of the same sex in order to excite or charm those of the opposite sex, generally the females, which no longer remain passive but select the more agreeable partners. So what Darwin is saying is that we see two patterns of sexual selection for mate choice in animal species. We see either males are fiercely competing with each other over access to females, or we are seeing males are competing with each other in other ways in which to charm or be selected by the females as mate partners. And elephant seals are kind of a good example that we look at because they exemplify this pattern of sexual dimorphism. The more extreme or the more kind of visually apparent differences we see between males and females of a given species, the higher degree of competition we see in the males of those species, right? So if you look at humans, males and females, apart from some few minor anatomical differences, we don't look that much different from each other, right? So that kind of indicates that in our evolutionary history, humans kind of selected for cooperation, right? Remember in our last lecture, in the first introduction lecture, we talked about the loss of the sectorial canine complex, right? Since humans do not have big, or human males do not have big canines, we aren't running around threatening each other for access to females, right? So there's more cooperation within our species. On the other hand, we see a huge degree of difference in sexual dimorphism between elephant seal males and elephant seal females, right? And this is a species in which males fight viciously with each other over access to those females. This is showing you a male, and those kind of white markings that you see are scars. You know, that's not dry skin. Those are scars that he has from fights that he have had with other males. So now that we've looked at an example with our elephant seals of kind of violent competition for mates, let's look at an alternative example, or the other pattern of sexual selection that we see, this kind of notion of charming or kind of competing to be selected as a mate. And bird species are a great category of animals to look at for this particular type of sexual selection, and more particularly birds of paradise. These are the ones in which the males are extraordinarily fancy in terms of their plumage or their feathers, and the females actually look really plain because the males are in essence trying to impress the females to be selected as mates. So the females don't need to look, they have fancy plumage and bright colors and things like that because they're not looking to impress. They're the ones doing the choosing. So the process is that males will space themselves out to have best access to females. That's actually a pattern that we see in general amongst most animal species. Females will generally stay closer to food sources. Yet again, another pattern that we see in most animal species. In the case of birds of paradise, it always starts with mating calls. Once the female comes, the male will begin his dance. Once the dance is complete, there is an inspection period and a touch. If the female accepts the male, then mating occurs. If not, she will either fly away or give him a sign that she does not accept, and the male will move on to another female. So in birds of paradise, the males are very fancy and the females are, in essence, are very choosy. And to begin to wrap things up here, one concept that we're going to kind of address a lot more later on in the semester when we talk about kind of the diversification of early hominids as well as the diversification of the earliest primates that evolved, is this notion of adaptive radiation, right? This is the diversification of an ancestral group of organisms into new forms that are adapted to specific environmental niches, right? Much like the finches that we talked about. In biological anthropology, an adaptation is inherited, right? It can be a physical trait or a behavioral tendency, and adaptations allow a species to better fit with its environment and, more importantly, to reproduce successfully, right? Because remember, we're going to say over and over again, the name of the game in evolution is to reproduce. And if you have a trait or behavior that is not affecting reproduction at all, that trait or behavior is going to continue to be passed to the next generation, right? In the lab, as well as in some of the other lectures, we're going to look at some of these different traits that, some of them affect reproduction and some of them don't, right? And we're going to see that the ones that affect reproduction tend to get weeded out of a population, things like genetic diseases and stuff like that. But others that don't affect the individual until after reproductive period or after reproductive age tend to stay around in the population because the genes inevitably still get passed on. But we'll talk about all that in much more detail in subsequent lectures. And looking at the last, we have a few modern trends in evolutionary theory that we'll kind of talk a little bit about during the semester. We have the 20th century Panglossian paradigm, the notion that every trait a creature displays is the result of a direct adaptation to the environment. And we know today this isn't really the case, right? We have actually tons of features on our own bodies that serve no functional purpose. They're just there because of changes in other features. A good example is your chin, right? The human chin serves no functional purpose, right? It doesn't support us. It doesn't do anything for us. It doesn't even, but it is where the growth plates in your jaw meet. We have McShay's global trend that all creatures are working towards increasing complexity over time, which is actually not true. We see creatures that have actually lost a fair degree of complex traits over time. So Gould, Stephen Jay Gould, who's one of my favorite evolutionary biologists, argues that global trends are kind of a statistical artifact and don't really exist in reality. We also have a gentleman named Turney that says global trend towards downward evolutionary versatility. And this actually cannot be proven empirically. So we're not going to talk a whole lot about the details of a lot of these evolutionary theories. We're going to stick to just the basics. What did Darwin have to say? What can we see as terms of what goes on in the actual animal kingdom? And with that, I'll kind of wrap up this lecture, and we will move on to talking about genetics as well as some of the genetic diseases that affect human populations today.